You got your recording all set up?
We good.
Cool.
Pin you here.
What's up, guys? We are going to talk some biomechanics stuff today. So yeah, let's just get into it. So what we're going to cover today is there's a few important things we got to look at. The biggest thing that we want to remember is that human movement is always going to exist on a continuum, and that there's nothing is really wrong. It's just the appropriate context and application of all of those movements for every single person and everything that we're going to be looking at in the scope of movement, right? So it's like, for example, if we're looking at this, pretty much on social media right now, there's like a blanket war against like extension, right? And everybody wants everything to be neutral and everything to be like neutral or flex or kyphotic posture for the upper back and things like that. But again, if we're looking at things like barbell squatting or sprinting or jumping, good luck at doing those in a very neutral posture, right? Those are things that we're going to need to have some extension in to complete the movement and complete the task. So this is what I mean by things exist on a continuum. Everything is right. We just have to look at the time and the application of it and see if it's right for that particular context and that particular goal and movement that the person is doing, right? And this is where we're going to kind of talk about on Wednesday. We're going to kind of talk about the way that we kind of program out and bucket out movements through capacity, sensory motor drills, and output drills to see if we're using the right things for each one. When we go over some exercise selection stuff on Wednesday as well, we're going to be covering a little bit more of things like this, right? So another thing, it's like right now, like flexion patterns are also evil, extension patterns are evil, neutral is like the way that it needs to be done. But again, like I said, with a barbell squat or a sprint or a jump, the same thing would apply to doing something like a log clean and press or a Zercher clean or a Zercher deadlift or like an Atlas stone for a flexion pattern. Good luck doing any of those in extension or neutral, right? Those are not going to be something that you can achieve or something that you can do at all. Pronation and supination is the same thing too, where people always look at pronation as something that's super evil. Unless you're unless you like are like living in supination, then you need pronation. And the same thing with supination, right? Where the opposite is always looked at as kind of like demonized, but we're not looking at this as what is actually needed for the particular task at hand. And the reason I wrote out here eggs and cancer is because of this. It's if you look at like how fitness people do things and the studies that have been done on eggs, like it's like every 5 years, people change their mind on whether eggs give you cancer or eggs are like the best thing in the world. And it's the same thing with movement, right? Where it's like, everybody's looking at it where it's like extension is going to kill you. Your mom's already dead from it. And like, how dare you extend because now you've just got a curse on your family for the next 1,000 years versus, okay, well, no, sometimes it's okay. And it's the same thing with eggs, right? Like eggs in the nutrition world, it's like, if you eat eggs, you're probably going to be okay. If you eat like 1,000 eggs a day, you're not going to do very well for yourself. But again, it's all those things where like, it's all in the dosage. You're going to regret that seriously.
Don't
really bad.
Don't do that. Ever.
Yeah. Right. But it's just one of those things where the devil is in the dosage for every single thing that you're looking at and everything that we're trying to figure out here. So we need to look at applying everything in moderation and to the appropriate context for the task and for the person who's in front of us.
Also, I also, before Matt dives into this, just to talk about conceptually, like when we talk about extension, flexion, pronation, supination, IR, ER, abduction, adduction, you guys also have to keep in mind that if you can't do one, you can't do both. Right. Like you can't get into flexion without coming from extension, right? So if you're looking at dynamic systems, what we're talking about is, from a point of neutral is the ability to do both when the task is appropriate, right? When the task requirements, is essentially require those two patterns. But if you're stuck in a flexion-based pattern and that's your only option, you're not going to be able to get into extension, but you're also not going to be able to flex any further. So you're not going to be able to do either one of those things very efficiently. And this is where, like, when we do like table tests on people, like femoral rotation is a really good example of this. If we have somebody do a squat and they're not getting good depth on their squat, they're getting stuck in mid propulsion, they're not getting IR. that's because they're also not getting good ER, right? They're not able to externally rotate a femur because they're stuck in full range external rotation at that point. And they're trying to abduct the femur without rotating it through flexion, which usually leads to, again, compensation at the actual pelvis and probably the lumbar spine, right? So again, when you like try to think of these things as relationships, but the reality of it is like they're dynamic systems and they're going to work within one another. Like when you walk, you go through a series of supination, pronation, supination. Like that's stance, right? Like that's stance to toe push off, right? So we have to be able to do both of these things to create more dynamic movement and forward mobility or propulsion. And eggs lead to cancer. I saw it on a documentary on Netflix.
Right. And because you know that those are all like the number one sources of all.
That's what I trust.
Yeah, that's how I trust more than anything else. So the first thing that we're going to cover with this, and one of the most important things we've got to go over, is just the general theory of how muscles are going to contract, right? So the one that we're going to cover today is we're going to cover the sliding filament theory. This is just one of the theories on how muscles contract, but it seems to be the one that's the most widely accepted right now, just based off of all the literature and everything that I've seen and read. What we're looking at here is we are looking at how each muscle is going to contract, right? So we have two different fibers, and if you look down on the screen, I don't know if you guys can see my cursor, but we have the myosin and the actin filaments, right? So the actin filaments, these are little strands that have little attachment points for myosin heads to bind to and pull in, right? So what happens with each one of these contractions, and each time you go to contract a muscle, is the myosin heads attach to the actin fibers and then pull it towards the end point, right? And what we mean by the end point is we're looking at the way that these muscles are going to contract, because each one of them attaches to something at the very end where these fibers originate from, called a Z-disc, right? So a Z-disc is a vertical band of tissue where the myosin heads come from on one side and the actin heads come from on another side. And all it's doing is it's pulling those Z-discs closer together to facilitate muscular contraction. Now, they're pulling directly to the middle, so it's not like one's pulling all the way to one side. They're all shortening together at the same time. And again, when we're talking about shortening, one of the other things that we've got to look at here is that the only thing that's going to change about the muscle is the length. But the volume of the actual muscle is not going to change at all. The volume of the muscle is going to stay constant, right? So it's just going to contract, and as it contracts, it's going to shift upwards, and it's going to distort and deform to allow for those Z discs to move closer together, to move the muscle from origin to its insertion, right? So things are just going to contract and they're going to push a little bit closer together, but the actual volume of the muscle is going to stay the same. It's just going to shorten and allow everything to kind of bunch up a little bit more. Another thing that's important to cover here is that muscles only have one function, and they do one thing only, and they pull, right? So a muscle is going to pull from its insertion to its origin, and that is it. That is all it's going to do. It's not going to do anything else. Muscles don't push, muscles only pull, right? So even when you're doing pressing motions or doing any sort of a press, all that's happening there is you're actually creating a pulling force that shortens off a joint angle that creates that movement that we're looking for. But that push that you're doing, a horizontal pressing motion, is still a pull of the pec, pulling from the sternal head attachment to the humerus, creating horizontal adduction of a humerus to close off that joint angle from the humerus to the pec in the sternum to create pressing motions, right? So all it's going to do is it's going to allow pull to happen and create changes in joint ranges of motion based off of pulling from origin to insertion, or insertion to origin. With these two, what we want to look at is we want to look at the way that this is going to apply force and torque to a joint system, right? So if we're talking about a contraction, what we're looking at here is we're looking at a decrease in the joint range of motion, right? Or the joint angle. So if the joint angle of my elbow is right now, it's at 180 degrees, moving it to 90 degrees is going to be a decrease in the range of a decrease in the total joint axis, or joint degrees of motion here. Sorry, I had like 400 grams of sugar pre-workout, so I'm like in sort of like pre-diabetic shock because I'm cutting weight now, and I misread my directions.
The
So
degrees of motion in here.
yeah, those things. So all it's going to do is as that joint closes off and as that joint angle closes off, what's happening is the bicep is pulling from the insertion on the radius and the ulna to the origin up in the shoulder, right? So that's all that's going to be happening. The bicep doesn't change in volume. We're just going to create change in the actual joint range by that moving, right? And again, on the other side, as one side closes off, the other side opens up. So the tricep on the opposite side is going to lengthen to facilitate that change. So when we talk about fiber orientation, what we're going to look at here is we're going to look at concentric orientation of fibers, eccentric orientation of fibers, and mid-range. Another way we can talk about this and say this, and I'm going to probably say it like this from now on, just to make it a little bit easier for everybody to understand, is shortened versus lengthened versus normal, right? So this is going to refer to the optimal length tension relationship of muscle tissue on the human body, right? So there's a fairly standardized and accepted degree of normalcy for length tension relationships of a muscle, right? And this is where everything is going to be in closer to anatomical neutral. So anatomical neutral, if you guys are unfamiliar with it, that's basically somebody standing straight, facing straight forward with palms externally rotated, facing straight in front of you, right? So that's going to be more anatomical neutral. Everything is going to be standing a little bit closer, and everything's like all joints are going to be at like a normal degree, right? So if I have a little skeleton here, which I do, this is going to be relatively anatomical neutral, right? The hands are going to be a little bit out usually, but this is pretty much what it's going to look like. The spine is relatively neutral, pelvis is neutral, femurs are neutral, humerus is neutral, everything is neutral, right? Scaps are not retracted or protracted. They are sitting neutral on the body and just allowing the arms to hang down. So what we're looking at with this is when we look at concentric orientation of muscle fibers, what we can think about with this is we can think about this being more shortened and more biased towards being short. So if this is how it's going to go, this means that the joint axis is going to have less total degrees of range of motion than a normal one, right? Than a normally relaxed muscle group. So again, if we look at the one that I have here with the bicep, I'm kind of skipping ahead here to kind of cover this. If we're looking at the way that my arm is functioning here, is there a draw function on this? I don't think there is. I wish there was. So if we're looking at the way that this is kind of functioning here, right? Ooh, that's cool. So if you see how my arm is just kind of, my humerus is neutral here, but my elbow, my radius, and my ulna are not neutral, right? So my radius and my ulna are actually kind of drifting forward ahead of my body as opposed to being hanging directly down underneath my arm. So this is what we would look at here, and this is why we talk about this as like more of like a shortened position, is that my biceps are going to be more biased towards the shortened position because this joint axis right here at the elbow is a little bit shorter than the one at the on the backside, right? Where again, if we have the humerus drifting straight down here and then the elbow drifting a little bit more forward, the degree of range of motion on this side is going to be larger than it is on this side. So we're looking at this one being my triceps being a little bit more eccentrically oriented and my biceps being a little bit more concentrically oriented, right? So what this would mean is this is going to be, the biceps are going to be in a bit more of a shortened position. The triceps are going to be in a bit more of a lengthened position potentially, right? So this is what we're talking about when we say assess and check each one of these things. Yes, Kyle, I went backwards on purpose. I saw your face. You looked all confused for a second.
I don't believe that.
What was that?
I don't believe you did it on purpose.
No, I did that on purpose. I wanted to show off my small arms again. So what we want to do is we always want to be assessing and kind of checking the way that somebody's going to be, the way that somebody's going to be standing and the way that people are going to be, where people's biases are going to drift towards. Just based off of how their static posture is going to go, because what you can start doing is you can start working on building out better corrective exercises, quote unquote corrective exercises and training programs off of what you see that people need more, that are more likely to need based off of how their static posture is and how their body responds at rest. Right. So again, if I have more, if I'm more biased towards shortened biceps, what I'm probably going to want to do is going to be wanting to train my biceps a little bit more in the mid-range or lengthened position than the shortened position. right? So for example, for me, that would mean doing less things like concentration curls and more things like incline dumbbell curls or like standing like traditional barbell curls, right? Because that is an easy way that we can start working on training the fully lengthened position of a muscle, and we can also start training the mid range a little bit more, which is potentially going to start restoring normal orientation of muscle fibers and allow me to work on just getting more of a normal orientation of my elbow joint. And again, the same thing that would happen for triceps. If I'm looking at the triceps if I'm looking at my triceps here, if we're looking at them as lengthened here, what I would probably have to do is try to train them in positions where my shoulder is more extended, and then I go into more elbow extension, like a tricep kickback or something like a push down where I allow my arms to drift out to the side, right? Where I can allow full contraction of a tricep in the most shortened position possible and not necessarily train them in the lengthened position, because that may not be something that provides me more stimulus or positive stimulus towards growth and adaptation, right? So again, when we program and when I program out with somebody, everything that I do comes down to is just better exercise selection based off of the person that you see in front of you, how they're moving through their assessments, how they're standing at normal posture, and how they're moving when you watch them do their regular movements. So again, the implications for training and prep, this is going to be where you're going to want to give them more of the stuff that they don't have to try to build up on potential deficiencies. Because again, if we look at this in terms of joint stability and optimal joint health, if I don't train the lengthened position of my biceps very well, how resilient do you think my bicep tendon and my bicep tissue is going to be when I do things like max out deadlifts, where there's a tremendous amount of strain in the fully lengthened position of a bicep, right? Like the shoulder stability is probably not going to be very good. The actual bicep tissue integrity is probably also not going to be very good. So like doing things like that can be a very good corrective and preventative exercise, just because you're starting to train other ranges of motion that you don't normally train tissue in, right? And this is one of those things where like a lot of times what Kyle and I talk about on social media and Instagram is how like strength training ends up becoming corrective in nature, because what we're looking at doing is building on and feeding deficiencies that people have in positive ways that allow for beneficial adaptation and stress and application of stress. And then it all comes down to just graded exposure on that person over time, right? Where again, like the example that I just gave here, where my biceps exist in a more of a shortened position, that means that there's going to be more stress placed on them at any given moment because they are constantly kind of contracting and flexing. So if I go to do something like a max effort deadlift and they're starting to maximally stretch, right, and fully get in that lengthened position, they may not be very good at that. So I might accidentally preemptively shorten my arms and bend my elbows because my biceps might just exist in that position. And then if I do that, I'm taking a ton of pressure and stress off of my upper body and upper back and putting it directly into my elbow joints. Right. And I don't know if you guys know this, but I deadlifted 725 pounds on Saturday. Had to do it. Had to throw it out there. But if I do something like that with my elbows bent and my elbows in a more flexed position, this is where we're going to start seeing things like bicep tears. Exactly, Jay. That bicep tendon is gone. Right. So training things.
The old over-under grip.
Even with the old over-under grip. Yeah. Especially with the old over-under grip. The left bicep would be gone.
The underhand grip on a heavy deadlift is a bicep destroyer.
But I just do it because it's the kingly grip. Everything else is peasant grip, including hook grip. Hook grip is peasant grip.
Oh, I thought you did hook grip.
I don't know.
No, I don't hook grip. Sam hook grips because he's a peasant. Right, Turner. I value my thumbs way too much for a hook grip as well. I actually have to use them for things, unlike Sam. So what we're looking at here is like we just want to figure out different ways that we can shut up, Craig. We just want to figure out different ways that we can train muscles to allow for increased resiliency in these ranges of motion that you may not necessarily train. That's the whole purpose of what we're doing with all of this stuff is we want to figure out how to build the most resilient organism that we possibly can through the least amount of corrective exercise, quote unquote corrective exercise and warm up stuff humanly possible. everything that we want to do is based off of graded exposure of stress and accumulation of volume in these tissues that are going to allow people to really make adaptation and progress. You're not going to 90-90 your way to a posterior pelvic tilt. Like you're going to hamstring curl your way to a posterior pelvic tilt. Right? This is one of those things that we've got to look at where, like, if you are able to walk up a flight of stairs, you are probably too strong to do a lot of these corrective exercises. If you can deadlift more than like 80 pounds, you're probably too strong for a lot of these things. And you're going to be better suited by training out more than anything else, just because we're looking at the gradual application of stress and how stress applied to the tissue with proper cueing and coaching is going to orient the muscles and start to change the body's orientation a little bit better. Derek, it's almost exactly like I'm saying strength training is corrective, because that's exactly what it is. And again, if you're looking at any strength or any like physical therapy clinic or anything like that, or any physical therapy drills, if anybody's ever been to physical therapy, this is something that I got from Pat, and I've been pretty much Pat Davidson. I've been saying forever since I heard it from Pat. Is that if you look at all corrective exercises, they're just really, really low level bodybuilding drills, right? Like what is everybody's favorite one on Instagram is the wall angel. All right, you go against the wall, you keep your rib cage relatively neutral, press up overhead. What does that look like? This is a dumbbell overhead press, just with no load, right? So it's one of those things where if we're looking at this, where a lot of people end up getting lost is they end up kind of doing all of that stuff forever, instead of actually starting to work on applying load to those areas and those structures to create actual change. Kyle, you got anything you want to add? You made a whole post about this morning.
I mean, I think you got it good. I mean, the big thing, I think, going back to even orientation, because I think that's what kind of confuses some people with the concentric and eccentric, is if you guys understand that muscles only pull, right? Even joint extension is a muscle pulling a joint into extension, right? Like we know that knee extension is a quad pulling the knee into extension. Elbow is a tricep pulling the elbow into extension. If you understand that muscles only pull and they don't push is always a compound movement of various pulls. It's kind of like 2 rights to make a left or 3 rights to make a left. Then you can understand long and short positions relative to one another. And then all training set is, as Matt said, is problem solving, right? Like if I see an anterior pelvic tilt, I know I've got concentric orientation of paraspinal, spinal erectors, lats, hip flexors, and potentially quads. And I've got eccentric orientation of glutes, hamstrings, and abs. And all I'm trying to do is give those tissues or those structures more of what they don't have. So I want to give the eccentric structures a little bit more concentric orientation. So I'm bringing the insertion and the origin points closer to one another, right? And then I'm looking at bringing, more eccentric orientation or lengthening to those concentrically orientated structures and moving those insertions and origins farther away from one another. And all we have to do is pick exercise selections that create the shape and the structure and orientation that we're looking for and drive stimulus. That's all we're looking to do. And that's training. And we can make it way more complicated than that if we want to, but we don't have to.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's literally all we're trying to do here is try to not have exercise selection that resembles just throwing darts at a dartboard, and make it exercise selection based off of what people actually need and what they don't actually have. So if we look at this person, if we look at me here, kind of like what Kyle was talking about, we have eccentric orientation of the abdominal complex. So rectus abdominis, transverse abdominis, maybe internal and external obliques for sure. And we have concentric orientation of the back stuff. So lats, paraspinals, spinal erectors. Those are going to be things that are pulling from the top to the bottom, and they're going to be pulling more towards that midpoint here, which is creating a bit more of an anterior pelvic tilt in me potentially. And then on this side, we have rectus abdominis that does not pull very well. So everything is going to be more lengthened, right? So for me, doing things like crunches and planks and bear position may be a better exercise selection for me than doing a lot of other exercises, just because we can start working on biasing more of a concentric orientation of those abdominal fibers, right? Doing things like back extensions may not necessarily be the best thing for me to do unless I'm focusing on the full stretch at the bottom, just because of the way that my body just exists at rest. And this is kind of what we were talking about again in the beginning, where we're talking about training out or building out exercises based off of what people don't have, right? Is like, if you look at me, I already exist in extension, so I probably can't get into much more extension. So I need to work on developing more flexion and developing more of a flexion pattern so that I can then maximize my extension when it comes time for me to actually have to do so.
Ryan has a question in the chat that I'm going to address really quick because this is good. So Ryan asked, do you have tight lats? And the big thing with this is, if we're looking at eccentric and concentric orientations, tightness is, and like tonicity is no longer really part of the conversation we're trying to have, right? Because you can be tight in a shortened position and you can be tight or tonic in a lengthened position, right? So if we have an anterior pelvic tilt, we have concentrically orientated lats, which would be quote unquote tight. But because the rib cage is forward in space, we also have eccentrically orientated hamstrings, which are also going to be tight because they're being stretched from a longer insertion and origin relationship. Like the length tension ratio has been altered, right? So tightness for me is completely irrelevant. Like, I don't give a fuck about things being tight. I care about if they're lengthened or they're short, because tightness is just sensation. That doesn't mean anything, right? So when we look at the position of the rib cage relative to the pelvis, and we're going to talk about this in extension and flexion patterns, but this picture does a good job on it. Matt's rib cage sits over the anterior portion of his pelvis. If we went down to his toes, it would sit over his forefoot. So we know right now that we're going to have more, again, eccentric orientation from the front of the rib down to the front of the pelvis, the abdominal complex, and concentric orientation through an increased lordotic arch and flexion of the thoracic spine on the posterior side. So we know the lats are going to be shortened. All of those things can still be tight, right? Tightness is going to be dependent on the amount of stimulus within the environment, right? Like, is Matt just holding up his body weight against gravity? Or is he lying prone and gravity is not a factor? If he's front loaded, we're changing the tightness of where we're going to feel sensation. If he's back loaded, we're changing the tightness. So that's why we look at the orientation of the actual muscles themselves, because that's what we can actually affect. The tightness is probably going to be there because we live in a stimulus environment, right? Like, we live under gravity and then we live, we train under load. I don't want a lack of tightness, right? Like, I don't want rigidity where I can't move. And that's what Matt was kind of saying, as far as like, more back extensions might not be great for Matt because he's already in full extension. So what's he really doing? He's not going through much of a range of motion, except at the very bottom end, if he's actually getting a little bit of lumbar flexion there. Like in my post today, I posted GHR hamstring curls, but you'll notice that I kept my lower back pretty neutral and my ribs down so I could actually isolate the hamstrings, because I also go into more of an extension pattern, and driving that extension pattern further isn't necessarily beneficial. I wanted to train more concentric orientation of the hamstrings, so I kept a more neutral pelvis and a more neutral rib cage to allow for a more neutral orientation of the hamstrings, which allowed for concentric orientation, right? So again, structures are going to determine these functions. Tonicity and tightness is really going to be dependent on load placement, whether it's your center of mass or whether it's external.
And that's one of those things too, where it's like, if you look at me through like a classic description, my lats would be short and tight, right? So what I would do is start biasing my training in those positions to be biasing the lengthened position of a lat, which you can train and you can do fairly easily. We just have to focus on positioning the body in a way that you can put more stress into that position. right? So for example, for me, doing things like a supported single arm pull down where you can really focus on the stretch at the top without rotating through the thorax and rib cage, that's going to be a thing that trains a ton of the length and position of the lat, and it starts to actually work on developing that to bring me into more of a normal orientation. Right. So again, it's like I said here is like the thing we want to train is we want to train all ranges of the tissue, right? So I still have to work on training the shortened position of the lat. I still have to work on the mid-range position of the lat, and I still have to work on the lengthened position of the lat, even if my lats are more concentrically oriented. Manny asked a question about this being associated with pain, and it's not always going to be associated with pain, but one of the things that we can look at, and like this is one of those things where we can look at this in a way that, like, I can use myself as an example, right? I've been dealing with a lot of elbow pain in my left elbow. My left elbow has very limited shoulder extension, very limited shoulder flexion, and very, very, very limited internal rotation. So what are the muscles that are going to be associated with those actions, right? We've got serratus, we've got pec, we've got lat, we've got teres major, we've got anterior delt. We've got a bunch of muscles that are looking at this like extension of a humerus and flexion of a humerus, right? So what I have to work on doing is I have to work on graded exposure and applying more stress to those muscles to allow them to work on just building up a little bit more, just a little bit more tolerance, a little bit more strength in those positions. So I'm not actually going to be focusing on doing any sort of external rotation of the elbow, right? What I'm looking at doing is I'm looking at pronation and supination of the wrist. So if I can't pronate or if I can't supinate my hand very well, doing things like more bicep curls, because the bicep is an elbow supinator or forearm supinator, those are going to be drills or exercises that are going to be super important for me. And doing those in more of a position of internal rotation, so doing things like concentration curls with wrist flexion at the top, is going to be hugely important, because that's going to start biasing a little bit more internal rotation of that tissue, which will hopefully facilitate more external rotation. Because right now, if you look at my body here, because my scaps are probably retracted and my rib cage is probably pushed forward at rest, I live in external rotation. So I don't have internal rotation because I'm at end range external rotation.
But he also doesn't have extra.
Right. So I just don't have the capacity to go more. What was that?
So, but yeah.
What'd you say, Colin?
Can we address what pain is really quick too? Like,
yes, go for it.
So when we look at pain, especially non-injury pain, like if we're not talking about traumatic injuries, guys, like pain is essentially just an autonomic threat response, right? So when we're trying to access ranges of motion that we don't have, or things that we're not able to do, your body has two major responses if it does not think you can complete a task. One, it does not allow you to move in that task, and it creates tonicity within a joint and stops your movement, right? Two, it sends out a pain signal, right? And those are the two major responses your body has. And that's why I always have people, like if they can't get into a full squatty squat on an assessment, and they say, oh, I can't squat that deep, or it hurts to squat that deep, I have them lay on their back and pull their knees to their chest. So that they realize like they do have the movement competency, or the movement potential, I should say, to get into a full depth squat. They just don't have the competency to get into a full depth squat, right? But they can go into full hip and knee flexion with no pain, right? So that's not an injury. That is just, you don't have enough exposure to that stimulus to have the ability to perform that movement, and your body is trying to stop you from doing that movement because you're not good at it, right? So if we're dealing with like quote unquote chronic pain, and I wrote this in my post today, a lot of that has to do with people simply not moving enough, more than anything else. If we can give those people movement exposure and confidence in movement and strength, the pain kind of goes away more often than not, right? That doesn't mean you load them up and you put them like, under a 400-pound squat on their first day to give them exposure. Like Matt said, it's graded exposure, right? We use constraints. We use different exercise variations. We find things that they're able to do and set them up for success, get them used to moving in those ranges of motion, and then progress as necessary. Right. But pain for me, and like, again, especially if someone's coming in a non-rehabilitative or a non-injury history, context, like that's just not moving enough. And we have to be able to give those people what they need, but we have to do it intelligently. But not moving is not the solution to pain. Like, avoidance is not the solution to handling pain, right? Decreasing a stimulus doesn't allow you to overcome that stimulus. We only adapt with more exposure, right? We only make change with increases of exposure, not decreases.
Right. And that's like one of those things that I see all the time when people like talk about hurting their back deadlifting. So I'm not going to deadlift ever again. It's like, okay, well, have fun ever bending over ever again, because now you're not stressing the spinal erectors and paraspinals in a way that you would in a deadlift. Whereas if we were to just take you back down to a significantly lower volume, lower weight, and lower intensity, and start focusing on gradually building back up over time again, you'll probably recover and be stronger than you were previously, as long as we're focusing a little bit more on position and how the body or how physics is going to apply tension and stress to the body's, to the tissue. Right. So it's just one of those things where graded exposure, volume management, and fatigue management is probably the best thing that you can do for pain, which we will cover when we go over all the programming sections and stuff like that. Just because that's the number one thing that you can do for somebody who's in pain. Like, for example, I just started working with another athlete 2 weeks ago, and I sent him his program. He's on week 2 of his program. He sent me his check-in on Friday, and he goes, "I've never felt this good, and I don't know what you've done about it." I was like, "Dude, I reduced your volume by like 40%. Like, I just allowed you to, like, I just picked better exercises that allow you to express movement at a higher quality, because you're a very advanced lifter and we don't need you to be doing 15 sets of quads a day. So we can drop that down a lot so you can express a little bit more output on each one of those sets and make them more quality sets, spread out your volume over the course of the training week so you can maximize your output over the course of the training week, and then figure out what we can do to cut your volume where we need to allow you to optimally recover." And like, that's what it really all comes down to. It's actually, so Derek, you'd be surprised. The load is actually not going to be, the absolute load is going to be lighter, but the effort is still going to be at 100%. Right. So that's for sure. Like, the load is going to be lighter because he's not good at those movements and not good at training muscles in those positions, but the effort is still going to be there. And that's one of the biggest things that I'm looking at with this too, is that, like, a lot of times what people do when they talk about quote unquote fatigue management, load management, or injury management, this is going to be a little bit of a rant that I'm just going to go on really quick.
Dude, you've gone through 3 slides and we're 40 minutes.
Kyle, stop. Leave me alone. Kyle, you're not one to talk. We have an hour and a half calls, and you like to go for 2.5 hours each time. But what I look at with this is, like, we're looking at still applying effort, because if we're just sitting there at like an RPE 5 on movements that you suck at, like, you're not going to make any actual structural change because the load is too light and there's no actual stimulus being applied to the body. So effort still has to be applied to each one of these movements. Cool. Let's go on to the next one. Oh, Kyle, you want to talk again? What was that?
No, I was going to answer an actual question.
Oh, cool.
Instead of just going on a rant.
I am riding the sugar rush, Eric.
I was going to answer Jay's question here. So if someone lives in extension, you bias them more towards flexion in their training, or the opposite. So we bias them more towards flexion so that we can actually regain proper extension, not a place of extension, but the actual movement of extension, right? Because if you're at full end range extension, you can no longer extend, right? Does everybody understand like how that continuum works? So we have to bias that person into a little bit more flexion, right? Or compression. We can also use like compression expansion terms here if we want to, but we have to bias them into a little bit more flexion in order to be able to achieve the extension needed for some of these movements. Like, where we get a lot of our power lifters, for instance, in trouble, like when they come to us, is they're in a fully extended pattern and they're running into a wall where they're under heavy load and they can't extend further when they need to, because instead of starting at a point of neutral, then going into extension, they're starting at a point of max extension and then trying to find more extension. which doesn't work. You can't access what you don't have. Right? Does that make sense to everybody? Because that's something that we get a lot for people who kind of have a misunderstanding of the destination of like thoracic extension versus the actual action of thoracic extension. And I think there's a lot of misconceptions there.
Because a lot of people don't know how to critically think about things.
Not saying you, Jay.
Not you,
We're
Jay.
talking about Instagram. Instagram is a hellhole of people who make comments on shit and don't think.
And don't understand what they're actually talking about. We actually had another question there from Manny. This is a good one too that we can go over. Do tempo and pauses play a big role on training different positions? Yes, especially if you have limited equipment, right? So for example, if I'm doing something like a lateral raise and I want to bias the shortened position, I just give you like a 2-second pause at the top, right? Where we're applying more time under significant tension to that top and shortened position of the movement. Whereas if I wanted to make it more of like a lengthened position exercise, what I could do is work on the eccentric, could be a little bit slower tempoed as well, right? So that's a great constraint that you can use very easily with limited equipment to make huge changes in how somebody's going to move and how you're training a particular muscle group in that person. So if we move up to the next step is going to be talking about the thorax. So if we're looking at the thorax here, the thorax is going to be the upper rib cage, the rib cage and everything that's going to attach to the rib cage, right? So we're just going to cover today the upper body. And then on Wednesday, we're going to cover the lower body and some exercise selection and application. So this is going to just be the upper position of the trunk from around the belly button up. This is going to contain all of the respiratory and circulatory muscles and a ton of bones. All of these bones move. And all of these...
lot of cartilage.
Lot of cartilage. If you look at this here, again, I love this little pointer feature. All of the white stuff here is cartilage, right? All that like light blue, white stuff is cartilage. So all of those things and everything that's attached to cartilage there is going to move because cartilage is a mobile structure. So whenever people look at the rib cage and they say the ribs don't really move that much, it's because they don't understand what the body actually is. So if we're looking at this, we're looking at how the thorax is going to influence the center of mass. And in my opinion, and Kyle probably agrees with me as well, the sternum and the thorax is probably the main influencer of your center of mass, right? If we influence the position of the thorax and position of the sternum, we are going to do a significantly better job influencing your center of mass than we would if we were to change orientation of the pelvis first. Right? The easiest example that I can give you guys is a back squat versus a front squat. So what happens if you put the bar on your back, we have a sternum that drives up. We have a rib cage that extends forward, right? If we then put a bar on the front and we make people do a front squat, we have a sternum that comes down and we have a rib cage that retracts and internally rotates. Right? The downstream effects of things that are going to happen there is if you're in a back squat, we're probably going to have a little bit more of an anterior tilt in the pelvis. If we have a front squat, we're probably going to have a little bit more neutral or posterior tuck to the pelvis. Right? So the sternum is probably going to be one of those things that influences the pelvis and other structures a little bit more than vice versa, which is why I wanted to cover the upper body first, because it's probably the sternum is probably a little bit more important for movement positions and patterning than the pelvis is going to be. Because again, if you stand up, you can remain in an anterior, like a sternum up position where you're kind of extended, but posteriorly tuck your pelvis. Like that's something you can very easily do. It's going to feel like shit in your lower back and it's going to feel super tight, but you can do that. Whereas if we get into that same position and we kind of retract and internally rotate a rib cage, it's going to be a lot harder to remain in an anterior pelvic tilt. Cool. Next slide. So the next is underneath the rib cage, we have a whole bunch of stuff, right? And again, contrary to popular belief, all of your respiratory organs exist in your rib cage. None of these things exist in your abdomen. Sorry to break some hearts. So what we're looking at here is we've got the diaphragm, we've got the lungs, right? So the diaphragm is going to be the main driver of respiration, and it's always going to be working regardless of ISA position and ISA pattern. It's just going to be how is it biased and how is the body compensating to achieve the movement. So what happens with the diaphragm to create and facilitate respiration? So what the diaphragm is going to do is the diaphragm, if you look at it here, the diaphragm exists in a dome, in an asymmetrical dome. So what happens is as the body inhales, the diaphragm is going to pancake out and push the lateral aspects of the rib cage outwards. What this does is this creates a vacuum between the diaphragm and the lungs. What happens then is the lungs descend. As the lungs descend, air is pulled into the body. So again, it's another pull that's happening as you're taking in a breath of air. Right? So the lungs are pulling down or descending a little bit, pulling air in through the nose and the mouth. Mostly the nose. Don't be a mouth breather. As the body goes to exhale, what's going to happen is those lateral aspects of the rib cage are going to shorten and they're going to come closer together. The diaphragm is going to dome and ascend. This is going to push the lungs up, which expels CO2. Right? So again, that's a pull inwards from the rib cage to then push air out of the body. So this is how the body is going to function. This is how respiration is going to happen. If you have a narrow or a wide ISA, these are still both going to happen. It's just going to be what else is happening to allow both of these things to function. So if we have a very narrow ISA, we struggle with lateral expansion of the rib cage. So what's going to happen to allow the diaphragm to descend is the rib cage is going to shift upwards, right? So the rib cage kind of shifts upwards and we get that kind of chest breathy thing that everybody looks at, right? When people say that chest breathing is bad. So we get clavicles that lift, we get traps that pull up, we get SCMs and levator scap that pull up to pull the rib cage up to allow the diaphragm to pancake out to create that respiration, to create that inspiration. If we have a wide ISA, meaning that the lateral aspects of the rib cage are pushed outwards more, we then do not have the ability to close that off. So what's going to happen when we get this? We're going to have a pump handle and a rib cage that pushes downwards and pushes in to create that position. So what we're looking at here with the ISA is the infrasternal angle, which if we look at, this is the infrasternal angle right here. It's the angle of the diaphragm. It's where the diaphragm attaches to the rib cage. Right? So this is a normal ISA at 90 degrees, which is going to be totally at neutral and at rest. Right? So this would be kind of like in between breaths or as you're starting to go from exhalation to inhalation, it's at about 90 degrees. Right? So what we're looking at with this is we're looking at how the body and how breathing is going to affect these things. And what we're looking at doing is just like when we're talking about muscle action and function, where you're wanting to train things that the body doesn't necessarily have, we want to do the same thing from a respiratory level. Where if I live in that wide ISA, so my rib cage, the lateral aspects of my rib cage are pushed out and I can't exhale because I can't get that diaphragm to pancake or dome up to push oxygen out very well, what we want to focus on is more exhales. If we are in the opposite position and we are here and the diaphragm is more domed up and we cannot get it to push out, we want to bias more inhales. Right? So again, this is just one of those things that we want to look at from a warm-up or a corrective strategy. If you want to look at this from that perspective, as a way of training different respiratory patterns to work on also respiratory variability. Because again, this is one of those things where if we look at the stats of people who have breathing disorders and breathing issues, it's very high. So training breathing patterns and like working on breathing strategies is probably going to be something that people need to work on as well. And again, what you'll find is that if you are a wide ISA, that means that you're technically stuck in a more inhaled state. You also suck at inhaling, right? So you're also bad at that. We just need to fix your exhale first.
If you can't do one, you can't do the other.
You
Like
can't do one, you can't do the other.
that's the big theme that we talk about with the extreme end ranges of any range of motion, even respiration cycles. Because if you can't, a lot of people have troubles with the full inhale because they're never exhaling CO2. Like they're never getting full exhalations, right? It's just like you can't internally rotate without coming from a place of external rotation. It's the same process. You can't take a full inhalation without a full exhalation preceding it, right? And that's what you see, and that's how we have to think about human movement at all levels, right? You can look at like gradients of cells at that level. You can go all the way down to gradients, right? But if we look at big global patterns like extension, flexion, inhalation, exhalation, compression, expansion, all of these things work in tandem. They're not opposites. They're in a relationship with one another. And you have to think about from a dynamic perspective, one leads to the other so it can cycle back, right? So to inhale, you have to exhale to inhale, right? You have to ascend a diaphragm to descend a diaphragm to ascend a diaphragm. If Matt goes back to that thorax picture really quick, again, the rib cage is meant to compress and expand, right? It gets bigger and it gets wider through inhalations and exhalations. And that's what creates the vacuum that Matt was talking about. And if you can't get either compression or expansion, you will have compensations in the movement of the thorax up or down, right? You'll get flare, like rib flaring. You'll get a lot of neck breathing. You'll get posterior compression from overly concentric or concentrically orientated back muscles and retracted scapulas. We can talk, like we can get a lot of different things from this perspective, but you will get compensations to stabilize the rib cage from a muscular standpoint as well. And that's going to limit your ability to compress and expand, right? So again, that's why breathing is important. That's why the rib cage is important, because it will affect everything downstream. And that's why we try to address that first, because the pelvis will also generally follow the rib cage's position.
Yep.
And like Matt said, when you put a barbell on your back or you front rack it, all that happens there is that barbell becomes your new center of mass and your rib cage moves around it to adapt. And you get muscular integration that allows you to stabilize that load now. And that's the easiest way to apply a constraint to integrate muscular systems that you're trying to find.
Which is a really good thing that you guys can use to your advantage when you see somebody who has a weird compensatory breathing strategy. Right? A really, really easy thing that you guys can do, because if you want to drive the respiration strategy that you're looking for, load them and make them do it. Super easy thing that you can do. Because again, it's like Kyle just talked about, where if that person is in that big extension pattern where they've got a wider ISA and you make them front squat, well, that's going to be harder for them to do that because they now have to retract and internally rotate a rib cage.
It'll close down right away.
It'll close down right away.
For it to happen. Lorna, yeah, we use our fingers from a remote perspective. We have
make them measure it. Yeah.
We have them do it.
So even in person now, I make people measure their own ISA. So what I'll make them do is I'm going to make them grab their hands and crawl down to their ribs and hook themselves underneath and hold and take a couple breaths right in that position. Because I'm not trying to touch anybody, but I want them to kind of hook their fingers underneath the rib cage.
Also, and it's important to also understand, like the neutral ISA, the 90 degrees, everybody goes from wide to narrow as they inhale and exhale. It's just, are you stuck in one position, right? That's
Are you biased towards one or the other?
None of these things are inherently bad at all. They're movements that we're all supposed to be able to accommodate.
Yeah. So if we look at these, all of these structures are also asymmetrical, which brings us to another point, is that the body is asymmetrical in nature. So if we look at the lungs, right, we have a diaphragm, or look at the diaphragm. We have a right side of the diaphragm that's a little higher because we have a liver underneath here. And we have a left lung that's a little bit weirder shaped because we have a heart right here, right? So the heart is here pushing down on this side of the diaphragm. The liver's here pushing up on this side of the diaphragm, which is one of the things that you'll typically see when you see people are going to breathe. They're going to kind of present with left rib flare more so than right rib flare, because the left diaphragm pancakes out a little bit easier because there's no liver in the way and there's a heart pushing down on it. right? Whereas like the right chest wall is going to expand a little bit easier because it's going to compress a little bit easier because you've got a liver pushing up on that. So if we just look at how this functions, we look at the body is always going to be relatively asymmetrical just because they've got these structures on different sides of the body. Cool.
Really quick, Raph asked about the role the abdominals play in this. And the short answer is for most people, a larger role than they should, right? Yeah. So the obliques actually facilitate exhalation, right? The rectus abdominis is a muscular strategy, is more of the utilization of a muscular strategy for bracing rather than correcting true inter-abdominal pressure through respiration strategies. So if you're actively using your abs to control your rib cage, that's kind of a shitty strategy for everyday life, but it might be a good bracing strategy for a super heavy deadlift or squat, right? Again, I actually posted on this a couple of days ago, but muscular strategies versus positional strategies, right? These are two very different things. Are you actively using your muscles to create a position, or are you creating a position and allowing your muscles to integrate into it? Right? One of those things is going to allow you to go through like respiration and gait cycles very easily and go about your day, but it's not a great strategy to deadlift 725 pounds as Matt does.
Hey, did you guys know I deadlift 725?
I'll throw you out. And the other strategy will allow you to lift huge amounts of weights for a short period of time, but is pretty much impossible to control throughout the course of a day. Like if you're trying to walk around squeezing your abs all day to control the orientation of your rib cage, good luck. Like good luck with that. Like first shiny object you see, you're gone, right? So there's a time and a place for both of these strategies. We don't want to mismatch those things.
Yeah. And that's one of the biggest things that we hope you guys get out of this is that the context of the person is the most important thing, and that the application of all of these things is probably going to be okay depending on the person that's in front of you. It's all about just choosing better exercises based off of an understanding of biomechanics that allows you to see how a person is actually going to move and what you need to do to actually train them better. Right? So if we're going to now cover some upper body muscle stuff, so now we've got bones and we've got the internal organs done, the major ones, the important ones. Now we're going to start covering some biomechanics. So we're going to cover the posterior thorax first because why not? So we've got the major muscles and we've got the functions here, right? So we've got lats, we've got teres major here, we've got teres minor underneath it, we've got traps, we've got levator scaps, we've got rhomboids, we've got posterior delts, we've got external obliques here, right? We had a conversation with somebody a little while ago who was talking about like loading the thoracolumbar fascia, but it's like, hey, that's inert tissue that doesn't receive any blood flow or have any actual contractile force. So don't talk about that. So what we're looking at here is we're going to look at how we're going to bias and train.
Myers is going to kick your ass.
What was that?
Myers? He's going to come after you.
He's coming after me. It's all right. He's going to be coming very, very slowly after me.
He's elastic.
Yeah, that's very true. He's going to bounce his way all the way to Texas.
Bounce his way to you.
So if we're looking at this, what we want to look at is we want to look at training muscles in similar lines of pull, right? So if we look at the fibers of the lat and the fibers of the mid and lower trap, they kind of function in the same direction. If we look at the fibers of the trap and the posterior deltoid, they also kind of function, go in the same direction. The rhomboid also kind of goes in the same direction, or the opposite direction, or of the lat, right? So if we're looking at all of these, what we're going to look at here is we're going to look at how to kind of train each one of these. So if we see the lat insert all the way up here and pull down in an arcing pattern towards the thoracic spine and the thoracolumbar fascia and the pelvis, what we've got to look at is we've got to look at training that muscle in its particular pattern and the way that muscle exists. Right. So this, and what we're looking at with the lat is going to be an exercise, a muscle that trains in a shoulder extension in an arcing pattern. Right. And that's an important thing that we've got to note here, because if we're just pulling straight and we're pulling linearly, we are not biasing as much of the lat tissue as we possibly
Hurry
can
up.
because we're not respecting
Here we are.
Craig, mute yourself.
Come on, bro.
Come on, Craig. Damn, man. So if we're looking at this, we got to look at the fact that the lat arcs, right? Because it's a fan-shaped muscle and it's a convergent muscle. So all of the muscles and all of the points of the insertion and the origin pull in the same line, right? So we can, yeah, Derek, I told you Craig is terrible. So we've got to look at what we can do to start training these muscles in a way that we want to train it. So again, the lat is going to be shoulder extension and more of an arcing pattern. So if you're doing regular chest supported rows like this, and we're doing regular chest supported rows here, and we're doing pull downs here, we're not really biasing and training the lat in a position that's going to create actual, or train the lat through its fullest range of motion, right? Because we're pulling in a linear fashion, which is going to be more teres major and teres minor. Right? This is just the way that we're going to look, because if you look at the way that the lat and the body is going to be developed in most people have really, really big and developed teres majors and very, very underdeveloped lats. Right? So they've got this big, wide upper back because all they're doing and all their training is upper back with linear pulls. And they don't have any kind of arcing pull that actually trains the position and trains the muscle of the lat itself, right? Because if we look at the lat starts down in the pelvis. So if we're looking at training a lat, the lat needs to be trained in things that are going to pull usually from up down towards the pelvis. So if we're pulling in a straight line, we are training traps, rhomboids, teres, posterior delts, depending on the position of the humerus. So this is what we got to look at here. And when people start talking about how like they're always getting lats and everything, it's like you're not actually getting lats in any of these things that you're doing because you don't know how to actually use them. So we need to work on figuring out, so like pull downs being a little bit less vertical. Yes, pulling down in front of you is going to be a better motion, right? So if you have the anchor point at about a 45 degree in front of you and you're pulling down towards the hips that way, that's going to be a better position for you to train in. This is just how the lats are going to function, is they have to go through an arc to be trained in general. And this is why I also wanted to start with the posterior chain stuff, because this is one of those ones that people always talk about, like, oh, I always got my lats and everything. It's like, well, you don't. You have your teres and everything, and you don't really train lats ever. So again, if we're training like doing like hammer strength, like chest supported rows, they can be a great exercise if you bias yourself and set yourself up in a way to actually train the lat, which again, arcing motion, like the lat fibers are going to want, right? So if we're looking at training everything else, when we're starting to train traps, rhomboids, posterior deltoids, what we've got to look at here is how those fibers are also going to run. So those fibers all run a little bit more horizontally, right? So what we're looking at with this is we're looking at lifting the elbow a little bit, and then we're looking at going through horizontal abduction of a humerus, going away from the midline of a humerus with that pattern, right? So it's going to be a shoulder extension and horizontal abduction of a humerus. So these are going to be things like your wider grip rows. And again, we always have to be respectful of sternal position with this, because if we're letting the rib cage flare, we're now starting to train rhomboids, and we're not actually starting to train the muscles that we're looking to train. We're not training mid traps. We're not training teres. We're not training posterior deltoid. Right? So picking out better exercises that are going to actually bias the tissue that you want to train is a hugely, hugely, hugely important thing to look at. Right? Whereas with the posterior deltoid, doing exercises like posterior delt flies, because the hardest position is at the very top, you're more likely going to be training mid trap and rhomboids than you are posterior deltoids, because the joint axis is moving so far away. The axis of rotation moves closer to midline because the load is so far away from the body. So doing things like posterior deltoid rows is going to be a significantly better thing to do to train posterior delts than doing any kind of single joint fly for posterior deltoids. Because again, the farther away from the joint axis the load is, the more that tissue is going to be biased to be the prime mover. That kind of make sense for everybody? Cool. Going to the mirror muscles next, the show muscles. Kyle was giving me shit because of this picture's half off the screen, but it's the only way I could get it to work. So these are the most important ones, obviously. They're the ones that everybody cares about. We got pecs, we got deltoids, we got external obliques, rectus abdominis, and biceps, obviously, for some gains. So what we're looking at with this is we're going to look at the pec, and the pec major is going to be the most complicated muscle in this thing that we're going to cover because it has the most fiber and the most surface area, right? So it's got a clavicular head, a sternal head, and a costal head. So it's got 3 different sections of insertion, origin, and attachment. And they all insert on the humerus. But then we've got the clavicular fibers up here. We've got the sternal fibers here. And then we've got the costal fibers down here. So like going back to like upper, middle, and lower chest days. It's actually a thing because we've just got to look at the way that the fibers are going to pull. So if we look at the way that these actually are going to go, right, these fibers are going to be pulling more at a downward angle, right? So to train the costal fibers of the pec, it's going to go adduction from up to down. If we're looking at training sternal fibers, it's adduction at a horizontal adduction at a normal or neutral angle. And if we're looking at training the clavicular head, it's going to be more of an upward angle, right? Just because if we're looking at the line of pull of those muscles, because it all starts right here, we have to bias tissue to pull in the line of those muscles, right? So again, when you see a lot of people doing like incline dumbbell press with very wide elbows to kind of bias the upper chest, they're not actually biasing the upper chest at all. They're just stressing the shit out of the sternal head fibers and the coracobrachialis without actually training the upper pec, because it's not allowing it to come upwards at an angle. Whereas if you're doing things like a converging hammer strength press that comes up towards the top, now you're actually starting to bias upper chest fibers, right? If you're looking at doing things that are pressing downwards, now you're actually biasing costal pec fibers. And then if you're looking at benching and doing things in the middle, now you're biasing sternal pec fibers. So trying to figure out which fibers of the pec you want to train for maximal performance is going to be an important thing to figure out. Because again, if we're looking at volume, like volume and tissue tolerance, if we are always training the sternal fibers of pecs and we're never touching the clavicular ones, or we're never touching the costal heads, we are going to be overstressing the shit out of the sternal heads and accumulating way too much volume there. And this is what we talked about when we were talking about leading to injury. We're just not giving the body what it needs to train through a full range of motion and train all tissue equally. Right? And that's why I wanted to cover this one a little bit more in depth, is because the pec is a very, very misunderstood muscle. And if we don't train each one of these fibers in the line of pull that they're going into, we're not actually training the pec properly. And we're only going to be covering the sternal head, which again is fine. Because if you're like a power lifter, your entire performance and everything you're going to do is hitting the sternal head of the pec. But if we want to work on training the clavicular head and the costal head of the pecs, you have to pick different exercises that are going to allow you to do it. Like incline barbell bench press doesn't do anything for the clavicular head of the pec. Incline dumbbell press will if your arms are at more of a 45-degree angle. Right? Chest flies are another thing where it's like upper chest flies. Like you're not training the clavicular head of the pec. You're training the sternal head in a more upright position and just biasing more sternal head and more coracobrachialis.
Shit ton of bicep.
And a shit ton of bicep. Right? Deltoid's a fan-shaped muscle that's going to abduct the humerus away from the midline and more of the scapular plane, which is about a 45-degree angle away from the body. Right? So it doesn't necessarily go straight out, because again, if we look at straight out is going to be trap. Right? So what we're looking at here is we're looking at how the deltoid is going to function, and that's going to be a fan-shaped muscle that if I'm here, it's going to abduct the arm this direction. Right? So the humerus has to almost come forward a little bit more to actually train the deltoid a little bit more effectively. It has to come forward. If I'm going straight out to the side, all I'm getting is upward rotation of scaps, and I'm getting elevation of a shoulder girdle that's training traps. And again, if you're training traps, fine. But if you're trying to train delts, put them out a little bit more at an angle so you can actually train those fibers of the delts that you're looking to train. External obliques are going to assist in respiration, because what they're going to do is they're going to help to close off the rib cage like Kyle was talking about to allow for a diaphragmatic ascension. And they're also going to help to stabilize the trunk. And then we got biceps for gains. Anybody have any questions on the mirror muscles so far? Arm farm, exactly. And then y'all thought I forgot about this shit. No, I got you. Don't worry. The reason why we covered those other ones is because if we look at this, we've got very superficial muscles, deep muscles. So this is why I wanted to cover them in this order, because we get the bigger stuff out of the way, then we get the deeper stuff afterwards. Right? So we've got the subscap, we've got the coracobrachialis, we've got pec minor, we've got serratus, and we've got biceps for gains again. So what we're looking at here is the coracobrachialis. This is basically a mini bicep that attaches from the middle of the humerus to the coracoid process, right? So when I was talking about how if you're training that muscle and you're training that pec fly in that position, all you're doing is you're getting a ton of stress in that coracobrachialis, because that's the action that's the path that muscle is going through, right? Again, this is the thing that a lot of people will mistake anterior shoulder pain or anterior delt pain for coracobrachialis pain, because they beat the shit out of that area and it's all in the same spot. It all just attaches up to where the anterior delt attaches, right? So a lot of people will say that their delt hurts and they've messed up their delt, and it's probably more of this one, right? Because this, again, if we look at this is a flexion and adduction of the humerus. That's a pec fly. That's a bench press. That's anything that's going to be closing off that angle of the humerus towards the sternum. Right? So this is a super misunderstood muscle that everybody just beats the shit out of and then says it's their shoulder's fault. It's like, just stop training your pecs like a jackass and you'll get better. We've got subscaps. Subscaps are going to internally rotate the humerus, and in some positions, they're going to assist in adduction and extension. All right? So like adduction in and extension out. So in some positions, they're going to start assisting with that. Pec minor is also another internal rotator of the humerus, and it's going to assist in inspiration because it's going to allow the body to expand the chest wall to bring air inwards. And they've got serratus, which is going to help to protract the scaps. Now, important thing to note is if we're looking at the line of pull of the pec and the line of pull of the serratus, it's in the same position, right? It's the same line. This is a horizontal line that goes this way and pulls and creates adduction, protraction of the scap, and it will help to facilitate a little bit more adduction of a humerus. Same thing with the pec, adduction of a humerus. So if we are retracting scaps as much as humanly possible, are we going to allow the body to use the serratus, use the subscap, to use the coracobrachialis and the pecs to create horizontal adduction of pec fibers? No, not at all. We're going to get coracobrachialis, we're going to get anterior delt, we're going to get lat, we're going to get tricep. So again, this is what we're looking at here when we're talking about not wanting to retract scaps when you're pressing. Even if you're pressing very heavy, we still want to just have depression of scaps, because we need to allow the scaps to move and use the pecs in a more leveraged position to allow them to actually do what they're supposed to do and adduct a humerus, right? And this is one of those things that I talk about with people all the time when people talk about like retracting the scaps or everything. Put your hands, I want everybody to do this. Everybody, put your hands straight out in front of you. Touch your thumbs together. Both thumbs. We want both thumbs touching. Keep your thumbs touching and retract your scaps. Right? What happens? You can't. Your hands then start to come apart and they drift apart immediately because we're now creating abduction of humerus. Right? But what's going to happen if you guys are holding on to a barbell and then you retract your scaps, we are now going to create space on the posterior capsule of the shoulder because the hands are fixed. Right? So we're now creating separation between the scap and the posterior capsule of the humerus. So we are now using pecs and serratus as stabilizers. And we're not going to leverage that muscle tissue appropriately to create horizontal adduction. right? So we're now starting to stress muscle tissue on the back. We're starting to stress subscap. We're starting to stress rhomboids. We're starting to stress everything that attaches to the scap, teres major and minor, infraspinatus. All of these things are going to be starting to gain more stress, and they're not contributing to pressing. Whereas if we just depress scaps, if your arms are out again, you depress scaps, you can very easily keep your thumbs touching. So we can actually create and facilitate true adduction of a pec in that position, right? So we're not creating space between the scapula and the head of the humor, the posterior head of the humerus. We're allowing those things to function together, right? This is one of those important things that we kind of I wanted to make sure we cover with this, because it's something that I see all the time with people talking about as much retraction as possible, when what we need to really focus on doing is creating more depression so that we can leverage tissue like the pec and like the serratus, because those are much, much, much stronger tissues than the anterior delt and your triceps. Right? Does that kind of make sense? Cool. Lower body, we're going to cover a lot of this stuff on Wednesday. So I think what we'll do is we'll kind of call it here, answer any questions that we've got, and then we'll cover all the rest of this stuff on Wednesday with exercise selection and programming stuff. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and then we'll go over any questions that we got. Anybody got any questions?
We had
Kyle,
one.
you got anything you want to jump in and add?
We had one here. Let me pull my slides off. We might have already covered some of this, though.
Okay.
I need to move some stuff off the screen here. We actually answered a lot of questions as we went through it.
John just asked a question, so while you're finding that one, let me answer this one. So John asked, during barbell and dumbbell bench pressing, do you just cue depressed scaps and not retract? And secondly, do you encourage scapular protraction? Yes, for the first one, I just try to get people to depress scaps. And no, for the second one, I do not encourage scapular protraction. I just allow it to happen. We're just trying not to stop it from happening.
So question here. So how much does ISA impact a client's programming? For example, how am I integrating this for a fat loss client? The easy answer to that is most people who are overweight are going to have a wide ISA due to their structure and due to how their center of mass is pulling them forward. Losing weight is going to be the best way to affect their ISA in this situation, right? So again, like when we talk about ISA, it's just one measurement. We don't place more importance on ISA than we do anything else that we measure. It gives us a little bit of context into somebody's respiration patterns, where, like Matt said on the call, we might, focus more on inhalation versus exhalation during some of their patterns. But the reality of it is we're probably just going to look at, okay, if you're a wide ISA, I'm probably going to front load your squat, because that'll automatically close down your ISA. It'll get it'll get your sternum pointed downward again. It's going to get more abdominal integration just through loading scheme, and it's going to get you in a more stacked position for that squat. It'll get you more vertical translation of a pelvis, right? If somebody is more of a narrow and they could use a little bit of elevation of their sternum, and they can use more, lateral expansion, we might do a completely different pattern. We might use something like a Zercher, or we might use an SSB with a little bit more of a retraction, or God forbid, we might actually use a barbell back squat.
Oh my goodness.
Who knows, right? So again, all of these things are just squats. If somebody's not in a barbell specific sport, we don't have to use a specific kind of squat. We just want to pick the best tool for the job at that point and put people in the best position for them to move based on their goals. So the ISA it's one of those things that's like, it's kind of important, but then it's also not important depending on the context. Like if it's a weight loss client, the best thing you can do for that client's movement is decreasing their weight. Right? So me having that person lay down on the ground for 30 minutes and work through respiration exercises is doing absolutely nothing to get them closer to fitness and preparing them for fitness, because it's too low stimulus. I'm better off having them work and build up tissue resiliency, right? Like they're better off walking on a treadmill for 30 minutes probably than doing a respiration based exercise for 30 minutes for that person. And I think this is where like the corrective exercise, whole, niche bothers me, because for a lot of people, corrective exercise is categorized as less moving and less stimulus. And that's a fucking problem, because that's not correcting anything. It is creating repeat customers. So maybe it's a good sales tactic if you have poor ethics. I don't know. But it's not doing a lot as far as fixing any kind of problem for anybody, because all you're doing is limiting the exposure of stress. And the problem with that is we're not limiting the exposure of their environmental stress outside of the gym. So whatever changes that we might make over the course of a session are probably going to disappear as soon as that person goes back out into the real world or to their sport or to whatever it is, right? So we need to find ways to strength train. We need to find ways to accommodate stress. For a weight loss client, I probably don't care at all about their ISA. It's very low on my actual priority list for that person and increasing their health and fitness. Anything to add to that, Matt? This is a little ranty.
I mean, it's just one of those things where like, it's does it even matter?
Yeah. Losing weight will help the position of the rib cage.
Yeah. Like I talked about, like I've talked about this guy multiple times. Like I have a guy who's like 300 plus pounds, and like we lost 20 pounds, and that was a better like influence on back pain than any breathing exercise we've ever done.
Examples of encouraging full exhalation or cueing. So take a full exhale for me. Is anybody doing it? I see some cameras. So
Nobody's doing it.
Everybody's sitting down in a fairly stacked position. I want you to breathe in through your nose. Take a full inhale. Take the deepest, longest exhale that you possibly can and tell me what you feel as you're squeezing air out. Like squeeze it all out. Most of you guys are in shape. It should be like 20, 30 seconds.
Hey, remember when we had one person who did it and it was like a 6-second exhale?
That was you, Matt.
No, I think it was JJ.
I was just picking them out. So again, for that, who here felt their obliques and their TVA? Right? Those are respiratory muscles, right? So if I'm going to drive exhalation, that's where we do use some of those sensory motor drills early on to bring awareness. And we have people drive exhalation rather than just squeezing their abdominals to get integration of the actual oblique, both internal and external. Now, as we're going through like a front squat, for instance, or a goblet squat, I can cue somebody to drive exhalation on the concentric extension of that lift, right? And I can have inhalation on the eccentric. So I can drive expansion and compression relative to what I'm trying to get out of the movement itself. And I can get abdominal stabilization from that perspective, right? So there's definitely ways to drive it, but I'm typically just I want them to feel it first. Like if somebody's never taken a full exhale, cueing exhale doesn't do anything. Like I need somebody to feel what a full exhale feels like and what it integrates to achieve it. The majority of my clients over the years have never taken a full exhale.
Yeah.
In their 30 to 40 years of life prior to training with me.
It's very damn true.
Like it's a novel feeling for most of them. They get a little hypoxic. You see their eyes go wide. They get a little panic response because they're not used to it. Right? So that's why like when we do like ab exercises, I don't tell people to hold a plank for 30 seconds or a minute. I tell them to hold it for 3 full breath cycles. Inhales and exhales. 2 birds with 1 stone. It'll end up being 30 seconds to a minute, but I want them to focus on respiration rather than just bracing and holding.
Right.
Because it's a better strategy for everyday life. We're going to be talking about this during like exercise selection and stuff.
We did have a question a little bit earlier.
And Derek might need to unmute to ask a question too. So.
Eric asked me to talk about what I said about dumbbell flies again. So if we're looking at training dumbbell flies, right? When we're training a dumbbell fly, if we're training up high with the shoulder position here, when the shoulders are up high, we're not biasing we're not biasing the sternal pec fibers or the costal pec fibers. It's still sternal pec and coracobrachialis because those are now in a line, right? Especially as we get to that fully stretched position, you may feel like you're stretching the pec more, but you're only stretching the midline of the pec and you're stretching the bicep, the coracobrachialis more, because those are things that are going to attach and allow for a deduction of a humerus. So if we want to train those different fibers of the pec, all you have to do is you have to make sure that the line of resistance and the line of pull lines up with the fibers. So if we're looking at training coastal pec flies, you're pushing down and adducting in a downward angle, and the line of pull has to be directly behind that, right? So the cable or the cable for the fly would have to line up directly behind the arm. Whereas if you're doing the same thing for the sternal pec fibers or the clavicular pec fibers, it's the same thing. The resistance has to line up with the line of pull of the muscle fiber so that you can actually train those muscle fibers in a full range of motion.
Question by Mike. This is a good one because we actually talk about this quite a bit and usually get this question. So when you cue and exhale on concentric, how do you not lose Valsalva? So it's a different strategy. Like if I'm doing max loading, again, looking at probably 85% 1RM or above, or I'm looking at something that's more output driven from a squat or deadlift perspective, I can use a Valsalva technique. Like I have no problem with that. But if I'm looking to drive work capacity, holding my breath and squeezing is not a good way to utilize oxygen and get through reps, right? So again, if I'm looking at like breathing during exercise, I'm looking at capacity-based training. So that's going to be a lot of my accessory lifts. That's going to be lower intensity, higher volume, right? So again, it's just two different strategies for two different tasks. If I'm doing a max effort squat, I'm not breathing. I don't care about breath. Breath is the least important thing on my mind. So that's a super good question. I did not clarify that. So I appreciate you asking that actually. And that's where when we go into exercise selection and like the categories that Matt explained way back in the beginning, he
alluded to them. Yeah.
He alluded to them. So we're going to talk about sensory motor and competency. We're going to talk about capacity, and we're going to talk about output categories for exercise selections and exercise applications. And one of the things that we use with this is a breathing strategy to distinct between the three of these.
Yeah.
So yeah, if it's output driven, I don't care about breathing.
Yeah.
Like when Matt was doing his mock meet this weekend, did you exhale on any of your three lifts?
It was squat because it was easy.
Well, because it was submaximal. But yeah
everything else now.
But when you're not breathing, what do? You create a muscular strategy. Because if you're not breathing to create inter-abdominal pressure, your body has to recruit muscles to stabilize the axial skeleton, the rib cage, and the pelvis. Right? And so you brace and you Valsalva. And that's a muscular-based strategy to create pressure intra-abdominally rather than aligning the diaphragm, the pelvic floor, and getting in a stacking pattern to create positionally based intra-abdominal pressure, right? So it's just two different strategies for two different tasks. So yeah, that's a super good question.
Yeah. Derek, you want to unmute yourself and go for it?
Yeah, we can. Yeah, we got another.
I'm trying to think of how I want to say this because you guys kind of answered it already. Do you guys find like
a lot?
Yeah, exactly. So say you take somebody from like a very extension based pattern, like they're like very used to like retracting everything, like a typical powerlifter, right? Do you find you have to like really still worry about changing their breathing strategy once you take them to the opposite end of the spectrum, like a front squat or something like that? Like you're cueing a reach, you get like eccentric orientation of the lats and everything like that. Like, is it something that should automatically, you think, take care of itself, or is it something you still have to like drill?
You'll still probably have to cue it. Like all you're doing there is giving them the potential to actually take an inhale and get expansion. Like you're probably still going to have to kind of coach them a little bit. Like the structure provides the potential,
Yeah.
right?
But I
But
still do that, but I'm like also wondering, I'm like, okay, we have this different, like the structure is now different what they're used to. The way I kind of look at it is like that pressure it changes in a more, I don't know how I'm trying to put it here, but it essentially those structures feel a little bit easier when they're in those positions.
yeah,
Right.
you're going to get more posterior expansion on that front
Yeah.
squat simply because you're allowing if Matt goes back, well, we don't need to go back to it, but the rhomboids and the actual like lats that eccentrically orientate, and
Right.
that's going to allow for posterior expansion of the actual ribcage.
Yeah.
When you're fully retracted, like you would be in a back squat, just holding and stabilizing the bar, you're squeezing your ribcage into compression, and you're not going to be able to get air in without elevating the actual ribcage and using your neck for that.
Yeah.
That's what you see a lot in that pattern. Adopting the other pattern will allow for more potential, but you're probably still going to have to work on the ability a little bit.
Yeah. And okay, gotcha. Just want to make sure.
Yeah.
What I would say to that is like we've got to look at the position and load vector first, because if we can get the position and load vector figured out and applied properly, you should probably be able to fix a lot of those things without even having to worry about it.
That's what I'm trying to get to, like not even have
Right.
to like talk about it. Yeah.
Right. For example, it's like if we're looking at like a hack squat versus a front squat, if you have the opportunity to have somebody hack squat, like it's really hard to get them. Like it's just all you got to tell them to do is keep their full back in contact with the pad and then just sit down, stand up. Right. So they can focus more on what a power lifter wants to focus on, which is max output.
You don't have a bar on your back. You're not trying to retract against the pad there.
Exactly. And like that's the biggest thing that I would say is like what we've got, what I would say to do is work on picking different exercises that facilitate those positions. Like another one, an easy one that you can do is a Hatfield squat.
Yeah,
right?
that's my favorite. Dude, I love that exercise so much.
Dude, I mean, it just loads the neck straight down. It has just axial compression on the spine, but then you reach the hands out in front of you and you retract the rib cage right away. Yeah. Right. You get full range of motion and full depth in a squat, and you can actually focus on training just the output of the exercise as opposed to cueing all the breathing things that you're going to look at. And especially with the Hatfield, because you can super maximally load it. If you put that on their neck and like, let's say their squat max is 300 pounds, they could probably do 405 for 10 easily with a Hatfield, right? Because it's just
a nice overload too.
It's a nice overload, but again, because you've now got a heavy load constraint pushing down on the rib cage, they're probably not going to be able to chest breathe anywhere near as much, and they're going to breathe a little bit more the way that you want them to anyway.
Yeah.
All right. Cool. Created anterior compression.
Yep.
So the only place to expand is posterior.
Is in the back. Yeah.
Which is why Matt has me do Hatfield squats all the time.
Right.
Yeah. Well, that's why I do them too. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great exercise.
It's great. I love it.
It's fantastic. Good question.
Shout out Fred Hatfield for the best exercise ever.
It's solid if you want to drive that.
Really is.
Question on the call form really quick. Would someone who says that X muscle always feels tight and or is causing pain in an overly eccentric orientation, I might have to have you unmute, Manny. I.e., if someone's lower trap feels overly tight on one side while the other side is completely fine, would that usually come down to something is not aligned or overly concentrically or eccentrically orientated? So when you get bilateral asymmetries, the other big thing here is a lot of us have a rotated rib cage due to our diaphragm and the asymmetrical nature of the lungs and the diaphragm itself, where you will get a rib cage where the left side is going to be in a more extension-based pattern and the right side is going to be in more of a flexion-based pattern. If you're a PRI nerd, this is just called a BC pattern. But what you get with that is you get a left scap that is going to be more retracted, and you're going to have a harder time protracting the left side and internally rotating and abducting the humerus. On the right side, you're going to get a more protracted scap, and you're going to have a harder time retracting and externally rotating the humerus. So what you see a lot of people with is anterior shoulder pain on the left side and posterior shoulder pain on the right side is a relationship that you see a lot of due to stress when they're pressing. And that's because they're not able to get their scaps to retract and protract in coordination with one another. So they have a rib cage that kind of sits like this, And then instead of having their head here, they turn it here. So they also get a bunch of left trap going into the picture as well, right? And that's a little exaggerated. It also causes pelvic rotation. That's your AIC pattern in the PRI world. But it stems from a diaphragm, right? So that's where we'll do some asymmetrical interventions on somebody in that case, where we might train them a little differently left to right from a prep or accessory standpoint. And then with their big output based lifts, we're going to try to drive constraints that will allow for a more neutral rib cage, right? So that we decrease the degrees of freedom that person's allowed to move and try to get them better alignment from a thoracic standpoint to get them more even on that press or pull or whatever it is. Anything to add there, Matt?
Nope. Easy.
Matt's on Instagram.
No, I'm actually not. It's just the easy one.
Like to tease you.
It's like again, all this stuff just comes down to is like looking at the line of pull of the muscle and starting to train in its line of pull.
Yeah. Once you understand the orientation thing and the muscles only pull, like I said, it gets way easier to start looking at what that muscle already has a lot of, whether it's shortened or lengthened potential, and then what they need more of, right? And all we're trying to do is get as many things to neutral as possible so that we can go short or long when appropriate.
Yeah, at will.
Yeah, that's all we're looking for. And again, like a lot of these systems make it way more complicated than that, but that's what a lot of the nuts and bolts comes down to. For someone with a torn rotator cuff, same formula, tackle position, breathing mechanics, and exercise selection. Yeah, I mean, if you've got shoulder issues, again, like I'm going to look at proximal stability first. Like I'm always going to look at the rib cage position first, because the rib cage dictates what the scapula is allowed to do, and then in turn what the humerus is allowed to do. Like if you don't have rib cage position, you're going to struggle with humeral movement or scapular movement. Same thing with the pelvis. If you have a trouble with a pelvic position, you're going to struggle with femoral flexion, extension, and rotation, abduction, adduction, right? We have to kind of address what's going on at the actual axial skeleton before we kind of branch out to the appendicular. Injuries are obviously going to throw another just layer of complexity into any of these things. So you might have to move around some things. But I'm still going to look at the rib cage first, most likely, when I'm looking at like interventions. Only 9 minutes over.
Not that bad today.
We did good.
It's not bad today. So I didn't get to post my assessment to the Slack. I will do that today. Kyle locked me out of my old email. So then he finally reset my password, and now I have access to that YouTube channel again.
Matt forgot. That's code for Matt forgot his password.
Yeah, Kyle locked me out.
That's just code for that. Matt forgot his actual password.
You know what they say about a good contractor is a good contractor blames himself. A great contractor blames his tools. So
Matt is a tool. I've never seen one. So I will see you guys. We'll see you guys later. We'll see you on Wednesday. We'll talk lower body and dig into that. So if you have questions about, again, lumbar spine, pelvis, SI, femurs, all the way down to feet. We'll be talking about gait cycle, propulsion arc, and all that good stuff, all that fun stuff. So it should be a good call.
The slides will not be posted until Wednesday.
Yeah, we'll post the slides on Wednesday because it's only one set.
Right. We're going to go over that and exercise selection and things like that on Wednesday.
So thanks for showing up. We'll talk to you later.
Later, guys.